There is a kind of silence that has nothing to do with the absence of sound. It is something older than sound, something that lives underneath the ordinary noise of a family gathered around a table on a Sunday evening, underneath the scrape of forks and the passing of bread and the low hum of a television left on in the next room. It is the silence that exists inside people who have agreed, without ever saying so, to keep a particular door closed. The silence of a secret that has been maintained so long and so carefully that it has stopped feeling like a secret and started feeling like the structure of the house itself, something load-bearing, something that everything else has been built on top of, something that everyone in the household has learned, without being taught, not to lean against too hard. Most people live inside that silence for years without ever fully understanding what it is or where it comes from. They simply feel it, the specific weight of it at the dinner table, the way certain conversations always seem to drift in a particular direction and never quite another, the way a grown man can push back his chair and walk out of a room when a child asks a question that should be simple, and the way everyone left at the table understands immediately and completely, without a word being exchanged, that the question was not simple at all. That is the silence this story is about, and the family that lived inside it for over 40 years, and the 12-year-old boy who, on an autumn evening in 1982, asked the question that cracked it open. And what came pouring through the crack? 3 decades later, when the family finally had no choice but to face what had always been there. Stay with me from the beginning to the very end of this story, because what the Calloway family was hiding beneath that silence, and what they found on the other side of finally letting it go, will change the way you look at the people sitting across from you at your own table. I promise you that. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We love hearing from our community, and it means everything to us. And if you have not already subscribed to this channel, hit that button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let us begin at the very beginning, because this story does not start at a dinner table. It starts in a break room, with a cup of terrible coffee, and 2 young people who had absolutely no idea what they were walking into. There are rituals in every family that nobody questions. You pass the bread without being asked, because you have always passed the bread, because the passing of it is so embedded in the rhythm of your family's table that it stopped being a decision long ago and became simply what your hands do when the bread arrives. You say grace in the same words your grandparents used, because those are the words grace is made of in your family, and no other words would feel right, and nobody has ever stopped to ask why. You ask about each other's week and give answers that are approximately true, and nobody examines them too closely, because the asking is not really about information. It is about the act of asking itself, the weekly and reliable gesture of it, the way it says without saying, I see you, I am still here, we are still doing this together, we are still a family. The world has not managed to take that from us yet. That is what Sunday dinner is in most American homes. The weekly confirmation that the family is still intact, comfortable and familiar, and asking nothing difficult of anyone seated around it. But in the Calloway household, in a quiet, tree-lined suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio, there was something at the Sunday dinner table that was none of those things. There was something that had been present at every single Sunday meal for so long and so consistently that the family had stopped consciously registering it the way you stop hearing the hum of the refrigerator in a house you have lived in for years. It becomes part of the background, frequency of the place. part of the air, something you only notice again when it stops. Except this particular thing never stopped. It was there every Sunday, without exception, without variation, without a single word spoken about it by anyone in that household old enough to understand what it meant. Every Sunday, without fail, Eleanor Calloway set one extra place at the dinner table. Not a decorative plate left out by accident. Not a setting prepared for a guest who happened to be running late. A full, deliberate, completely intentional place setting. Fork on the left side, precisely positioned, knife on the right. Water glass filled to exactly the same level as everyone else's glass at the table. Napkin folded at the corner with the neat and particular care that Eleanor brought to everything she did, with the care of a woman who had grown up in a household where chaos was always possible and had decided early that precision was her answer to it, that how you arranged the details of a thing said everything about how seriously you took it and how determined you were to hold it together. The plate in front of that empty chair was filled with food at every meal. It received the same portions as every other plate at the table. The chair behind it was pulled in exactly as far as every other chair, and every person who sat at that table, Eleanor's husband Gerald, their eldest son Thomas, their daughter Sandra, and eventually their youngest child Daniel, ate their Sunday dinner in the presence of that full plate and that empty chair, and nobody, not once across 4 decades of Sunday meals, said a single word about it, not because they had not noticed. Of course they had noticed. You cannot share a table with an empty chair week after week and not notice it, any more than you can sleep in a room with a crack in the ceiling and not, eventually, know exactly where the crack is and how long it runs and which direction it goes. They noticed it. Every one of them noticed it every single week. But some things in a family become so embedded in the ordinary structure of daily life that questioning them starts to feel less like curiosity and more like aggression, like reaching out and touching the thing that everyone has silently agreed not to touch, like pushing on a wall that everyone has tacitly agreed to treat as a wall, even if you are not entirely certain what is on the other side of it. And so they ate their meals, and they passed the bread, and they asked about each other's weeks, and the plate sat full and untouched across from an empty chair, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, and the family organized itself around it, the way water organizes itself around a stone, flowing past it, shaping itself to its edges, incorporating its presence into the landscape without ever directly addressing the fact that the stone is there. Thomas, the eldest Calloway child, born in 1963, remembered the plate being there from before he could properly walk. He told Daniel years later, in the conversation that neither of them would ever forget, that as a very small child he had constructed a private explanation for it that satisfied him completely, and that he had never shared with anyone because, even at 5 or 6 years old, he had already absorbed the family's understanding that this particular thing was not for discussion. His explanation was that the extra plate was for God, that this was some form of religious observance his family performed that other families did not, and that God, being God and therefore busy, had somewhere more pressing to be on Sunday evenings, but appreciated the gesture and the acknowledgement and the full plate left in his honor. He grew out of that explanation gradually and without replacing it with another one that felt equally stable, and by the time he was old enough to form a better question he had also, somehow and without anyone explicitly instructing him to, arrived at the clear understanding that the question was not one the family was in the business of answering. Sandra, 2 years younger than Thomas, said she had asked once. She had been around 8 years old, sitting at the Sunday table, and she had looked at the empty chair and then at her mother and asked, with the direct and unfiltered simplicity of a child who has not yet learned the topography of conversational danger in her own household, who the extra plate was for. Eleanor had looked at her for a moment, those composed and watchful eyes settling on Sandra with a quality that was not unkind, but was completely, unmistakably final, and said, very quietly, in the voice she used for things that were not up for discussion, "That place belongs to someone who can't be here." Sandra had understood immediately. Not the content of the answer. The content was, in fact, almost no content at all, but the texture of it, the weight behind it, the specific quality of her mother's voice that said, "This is the answer, and that it is the only answer available, and there is no follow-up question that will be welcomed." Sandra had nodded and gone back to her food and had not asked again. Not that evening, not for the rest of her childhood, not ever. And Gerald, when people asked him about the plate in the years after the story finally broke open, in the years when there was no longer any reason to maintain the silence, Gerald would look at a point somewhere past the person speaking to him, at a spot in the middle distance where he appeared to keep the things he was not going to discuss. And after a pause, long enough to stop being a pause and start being a wall, he would redirect the conversation to something else entirely, as though the question had not been asked, as though the plate had never existed, as though 40 years of Sunday dinners with a full setting in front of an empty chair were simply not a thing that had happened. Until Daniel Calloway was born in 1970, the last of the 3 Calloway children, the one who arrived 7 years after Sandra. Unplanned and therefore, in the particular way of children who arrive outside the plan, slightly outside the established order of things. He grew up at a different angle from his older siblings. He was less trained in the specific social architecture of the Calloway household, less practiced in the art of knowing which questions the family entertained and which ones it did not, less conditioned by years of proximity to his parents' particular management of silence. He was, by temperament and by circumstance, a boy who looked directly at things, who found the not looking at things uncomfortable in a way his older siblings had long since learned to manage. He was 12 years old on the autumn evening in 1982 when he sat down at the Sunday dinner table, looked at the empty chair and the full plate, and felt, for perhaps the first time with enough clarity and enough force to actually act on it, the irresistible need to understand what he was looking at. He had seen it hundreds of times. He had eaten hundreds of Sunday dinners in the company of that empty chair and that full plate and that particular arrangement that everyone treated as perfectly normal, while also, somehow, treating as entirely untouchable. But something about being 12, about the specific quality of curiosity that 12-year-olds possess, the kind that has outgrown childhood's acceptance of the world as given, not yet acquired adulthood's learned tolerance for the things that are never going to be explained, made the question feel not just interesting but necessary, urgent, the kind of thing that if you did not say it out loud, you would spend the rest of the meal turning over in your mind, and the rest of the week carrying in your chest, and eventually, you understood, the rest of your life wondering about. So he asked it, simply and directly, the way he did most things, in the voice of a boy who did not yet know that some questions were not supposed to leave the interior of a person's mind. "Mom, who is that plate for?" The table went silent, not the comfortable and ordinary silence of a meal where the conversation has lulled between topics and someone is reaching for more bread. The other silence, the specific and unmistakable silence that descends over a room when a question has just landed somewhere it was never supposed to land. And every adult present understands in the same instant what has been asked and what the asking of it means, and what it is going to cost everyone at the table to navigate the next 60 seconds. Thomas, 20 years old and home from college for the weekend, went very still, the particular stillness of a person who is computing something they have never had to compute before. Not a response exactly, but a position, a way of occupying the room while this unfolded that did not commit him to say anything and did not require him to look at anyone directly. Sandra, 17 and 5 or 6 years into her practiced and careful avoidance of exactly this conversational territory, found something in the food on her plate that required her complete and urgent attention. Eleanor looked at Daniel, not with anger, not with shock, not with the expression of a person who has been caught doing something they should not have been doing, with the composed and faintly weary expression of a woman who has known, in the way that people who think 3 moves ahead always know these things, that this moment was eventually coming, who has not quite prepared for it, because preparing for it would have required acknowledging that it was real, and that the question was legitimate, and that the person asking it deserved an answer, and who is now, sitting at her own dinner table on a Sunday evening in 1982, discovering that the moment has arrived, and she is no more ready for it than she thought she would be. She looked at her youngest son for a long moment, and then Gerald Calloway pushed back his chair. He did it without drama, without announcement, with the slow and deliberate movement of a man who has made a decision and is carrying it out, with the specific and practiced efficiency of someone who has been rehearsing this exit in his mind for years, and is finally, at the gentle and unintended provocation of a 12-year-old's honest question, performing it for real. He stood up from the table. He did not look at Eleanor. He did not look at Daniel. He did not look at anyone. He walked out of the dining room, and the sound of his footsteps moving away from the table and the subsequent and absolute silence that replaced them was, Daniel said years later, the single most clarifying moment of his childhood. Because a man does not leave the dinner table when his 12-year-old asks a simple question. A man does not remove himself from the room without a word, without an explanation, without even a glance at the child who asked, unless the question is not simple at all, unless the question is, in fact, the most complicated and the most loaded and the most carefully avoided question in the entire household. And the leaving is the only response that does not require him to say something he has spent 30 years deciding not to say. Eleanor picked up her fork. She looked at Daniel with those composed and watchful eyes for just a moment longer. Then she said, very quietly, with the voice she used for things that were finished, "Eat your dinner, Daniel." And Daniel picked up his fork, and the meal continued, and nobody said another word about the plate that evening, or the following Sunday, or the Sunday after that, or in any of the thousands of ordinary and unremarkable Sunday evenings that followed across the next 3 decades. The question went back inside Daniel, where it lived, quietly, persistently, in the way that unanswered questions live in people who are constitutionally unable to stop thinking about them, for the next 30 years. It did not go away. It simply waited, with the patient and unhurried persistence of a thing that knows it will eventually be answered, for the circumstances that would make the answering unavoidable. To understand what Eleanor Calloway was protecting at that table, to understand why she felt she had no option but to protect it in the only way that was available to her, in the silent and weekly and entirely private ritual of a full plate and an empty chair. You have to go back much further than 1982. You have to go back before the Columbus suburb, and the split-level house, and the 3 children, and the Sunday dinners, and Gerald's chair at the head of the table. You have to go back to Dayton, Ohio, in the autumn of 1960, to a downtown department store and an employee break room and a cup of coffee that was, by any honest standard, genuinely terrible, and a young man who made a precise and slightly absurd observation about exactly how terrible it was, and a young woman who laughed before she had decided whether she wanted to, and the conversation that followed that laugh, and what that conversation eventually cost both of them, and what Eleanor Calloway spent the next 50 years doing with the cost. Eleanor May Hooper was born in 1943, the eldest of 3 children, the daughter of a schoolteacher mother and a father named Gerald, who sold insurance and drank with a quiet and steady dedication that his professional life never quite matched. Growing up as the eldest child of a household organized around the management of an unpredictable and self-medicating father, Eleanor had developed earlier than most children develop anything, forced into a precocious and exhausting competence by the simple requirement of maintaining some functional stability in a house that might otherwise have had none, an extraordinarily fine-tuned ability to read the temperature of a room before anything visible had changed in it. She knew, before anyone said a word, before a glass was set down too hard or a voice shifted into a particular register, when the atmosphere of the household was about to change. She knew how to adjust herself preemptively, how to redirect a conversation, diffuse a tension, smooth a surface, in ways so subtle and so practiced that the people around her rarely understood that anything deliberate had happened. They simply noticed that things had not escalated, that the evening had passed without incident, that Eleanor had been present, and that Eleanor's presence had, as it generally did, made things better. This was a quality that would define her entire adult life, the capacity to manage the temperature of whatever room she was in, to keep the surface smooth regardless of what was happening underneath it. It would serve her brilliantly in some circumstances and cost her enormously in others. And Eleanor would spend the rest of her life discovering, usually after the fact, which had been which. She was, by every account that survives her, exceptionally intelligent in the specific and slightly painful way of someone whose intelligence has significantly outpaced the opportunities available to her. Her high school English teacher wrote in a college recommendation letter in the spring of 1961 that Eleanor possessed a mind that works 3 moves ahead of everyone around her, which was both a genuine compliment and an accurate description of a quality that can be as isolating as it is useful. Because working 3 moves ahead of everyone around you means spending a great deal of your time in a place nobody else has arrived at yet, waiting for the world to catch up, managing your impatience with the gap. She had been accepted to Ohio State University on a partial academic scholarship. She did not go. The arithmetic of it simply did not work. A partial scholarship with the family's financial situation what it was, her mother needing at least one reliable adult in the household, her father's drinking, making the concept of a stable family income more theoretical than practical. So instead of Ohio State, Eleanor May Hooper worked the register on the third floor of a downtown Dayton department store during her senior year of high school, and she read everything she could find in the hours before the house woke up in the mornings. And she tried to figure out what her life was going to be. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, in October of 1960, a young man named Raymond Ellis walked into the employee break room, and everything Eleanor thought her life was going to be became considerably more complicated, and considerably more real, and then considerably more painful than anything she had been able to anticipate. Raymond Ellis was 22 years old, the son of a family that had come north from Georgia during the second wave of the Great Migration, drawn by the promise of industrial employment and the relative freedom of northern cities, and the possibility, always partial, always contingent, always delivered with conditions that the promise had not mentioned, of a life with more room in it than the South was willing to offer. Raymond's father worked at a manufacturing plant. His mother managed the household and the younger children and the specific and ongoing labor of keeping a black family safe and forward-moving in a city that was nominally more equal than the cities they had come from, and practically something considerably more complicated than that. Raymond was the eldest of 5 children, and he carried that position the way Eleanor carried hers, with a seriousness that went beyond his years, a watchfulness that had been earned through experience rather than assumed as a personality trait, and a particular quality of self-possession that did not need a room's acknowledgement to sustain itself. He had wanted to study engineering. He had the mind for it, the kind of systematic, patient, structural intelligence that engineering rewards. And everyone who knew him in those years would later say so, with the specific combination of admiration and regret that people use when they are describing ability that the world has failed, for reasons that have nothing to do with the ability itself, to properly accommodate. The money was not there for school. He worked the stockroom of the department store, sent a portion of every paycheck to his mother, and read voraciously in whatever hours the job and the family and the fundamental realities of navigating mid-century Dayton as a young black man left available to him, working through books with the systematic and self-directed hunger of someone who has decided that the education the world will not provide, he will simply have to provide for himself. He walked into the break room on that October afternoon, poured himself a cup of the department store's institutional coffee, looked at it for a moment, and said something. Eleanor could never remember exactly what, only that it was precise and slightly absurd and specific in a way that struck her back, immediately as different from the generic complaints she was used to hearing from colleagues about the quality of the coffee. Specific in a way that suggested a man who paid close attention to the details of things and found them worth commenting on, rather than simply enduring. She laughed before she had decided whether she wanted to. She was not, generally speaking, a person who laughed easily or without deliberation. She was the kind of person who smiled warmly and who could be genuinely funny, but who held her full, unguarded laughter in reserve for things that had actually earned it. The remark earned it. She laughed, and Raymond looked at her with an expression that was surprised and pleased in equal measure, and sat down at the small table near the window across from her, and they talked for 20 minutes about the coffee, about their shared supervisor, for whom neither of them had significant professional regard, about a book Eleanor had been reading on her lunch break that Raymond had read the previous year and had strong and specific opinions about, opinions that were almost entirely different from Eleanor's own strong and specific opinions about the same book. And the disagreement about those opinions was the most genuinely stimulating intellectual exchange Eleanor had had with another person in longer than she could immediately recall. She went back to her register when the break was over, and she thought about the conversation for the rest of the afternoon. She was not accustomed to being disagreed with by someone who had actually read the same things she had. She was not accustomed to a disagreement that felt like a gift, like being taken seriously, like being engaged with as a mind rather than accommodated as a presence. She went back to the break room at the same time the following day. Raymond was there. They talked again. By the winter of 1960, they were meeting after the store closed and walking the long way home through the parts of Dayton that neither of their families would have entirely endorsed, talking about everything, books and politics and history, and what they wanted their lives to look like, and what they thought the world owed people who were paying careful attention to it and not getting a satisfactory answer back. They were both people who had been observing the world with great care and intelligence, from positions that gave them a lot to observe and not always much room to say what they observed. And finding each other was, for both of them, the specific and somewhat startling relief of finally having somewhere to put all of it. What they became to each other was not complicated in the sense of being ambiguous. It was complicated in the sense of being real, in a world that was not equipped to accommodate it. They were in love, not the performed and socially convenient love of two people who have decided to be in love because the circumstances recommend it, but the specific and inconvenient and genuinely private kind that does not organize itself around anyone else's approval and does not ask permission from a world that would not have granted it. They were in love, and they both understood, without romanticizing the understanding or softening it in any way, that the world they were living in, Dayton, Ohio, 1961, a city that was not the Deep South, but was not without the Deep South's logic either, was not going to be easy about what they were, not hypothetically, concretely, in ways that had legal dimensions in some configurations and social dimensions in almost all of them, and that for Raymond specifically carried a physical weight and a bodily awareness that Eleanor could empathize with intellectually and could never fully share, because the fear that lives in the body of a black man navigating a white America in 1961 is not a fear that transfers to people who do not live in that body. They proceeded anyway. Not recklessly. They were both too careful and too intelligent and too aware of what recklessness in their specific circumstances could actually cost them for recklessness to have been a realistic option. But with the clear-eyed and willful forward motion of two people who have decided that what they have found is worth what it is going to cost them. That calculation, as it turned out, was about to be tested more severely than either of them had allowed themselves to fully imagine. In the spring of 1961, Eleanor was pregnant. She knew for 2 weeks before she told Raymond. She spent those 2 weeks in the specific and suspended quality of a person who is sitting with information so large that the normal machinery of daily life, the commute, the register, the break room coffee, the walk home, continues around her while she remains slightly outside of it, processing something that has not yet been fully processed, carrying something that has not yet been fully acknowledged. She told him on a Tuesday evening in April, in the park 3 blocks from her parents' house, on a bench where they had sat before, on warmer evenings when the park was full of other people, and they were careful about how they sat and how they looked at each other and who might be watching. She told him directly, because she was always direct about things that mattered, without the cushioning of preamble, in the flat and honest voice of a person delivering a fact that is going to require both of them to respond to it. Raymond was quiet for a long moment. His face did not change in the way she had been half afraid it might change, did not close down, did not withdraw, did not produce the expression of a man calculating an exit. He took her hand. He told her he loved her, and then he told her that he wanted to marry her, that they could leave Dayton together, go somewhere larger and more anonymous, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, cities where two people, living the life they were living, might be less immediately visible, less easy to identify and target and make pay for their choices, more able to build something that genuinely resembled the life he knew they were both capable of making together. He was not naive about what that would require. He said so directly, with the honest and unglamorous clarity of a man who has been navigating a version of reality that requires clear-eyed assessment rather than comforting fiction. He was not offering her simplicity or safety in any uncomplicated sense. He was offering her himself and the full and accurate weight of what their life together would cost and require. And he was asking her, with the respect of a man who understood that she was a person capable of making this choice, with her eyes open, to choose it knowingly. Eleanor went home that night and told her mother she was pregnant. Her mother told her father, and her father, Harold Hooper, who sold insurance and who held views about the correct order of things that were, in the language of his time and his class and his specific cultural formation, entirely conventional, and in any honest and unsparing language, entirely irrevocable, went to his study, closed the door with the quiet and deliberate care of a man who has already made his decisions and simply needs space to execute them, and made 3 phone calls. The first was to his brother in Cincinnati, who had a house with a spare room and could be trusted to handle a situation that needed to be handled away from the neighborhood's awareness. The second was to a doctor his brother knew, a man who specialized in handling situations of exactly this kind, discreetly and efficiently, and without the kind of documentation that would linger. And it was this second call that Eleanor, when her father came out of his study and told her what he had arranged, refused. She refused it without raising her voice, without tears, without the kind of dramatic confrontation that her father was probably better prepared to override with the blunt instrument of his authority than he was to handle the specific and immovable quality of Eleanor's refusal. She simply looked at him and said no. She was not ending the pregnancy. She said it once, clearly, in the voice she had spent 17 years developing for precisely the situations in which she needed to be absolutely unmovable, the voice that communicated, without requiring a lengthy explanation, that this negotiation was finished before it had started. Her father looked at her for a long time, reading her face with the assessing quality of a man who is genuinely trying to determine whether this is a firmness he can work around or a firmness he cannot. He found his answer. He went back to his study and made the third call. The third call was to the Calloway family in Columbus, to the parents of a young man named Gerald Calloway, a steady, respectable young electrician who had served his country, was building something modest and reliable with his hands, and had expressed an admiring interest in Eleanor the previous Christmas at a family gathering where Harold Hooper had been paying attention. Gerald was told there had been a situation that had been handled, and that Eleanor was a good and smart and decent woman who deserved better than what had happened to her, and that Harold Hooper believed Gerald was the kind of man who understood what it meant to stand by a woman in difficult circumstances. Gerald was not told who the father of the child was. Harold Hooper did not consider this information relevant to the conversation he was having. Gerald did not ask. Eleanor was sent to her aunt's house in Cincinnati in June of 1961. She and Raymond had one final conversation before she left, standing in the parking lot behind the department store after their last shared shift, in the specific quality of late June daylight that makes everything look more ordinary and more permanent than it is. What passed between them in that conversation, Eleanor never fully disclosed to any of the people she eventually told parts of this story to. She said only that Raymond had not blamed her, that he had understood what was happening and what it meant, and that he had looked at her the way he always looked at her, the way that nobody else did, the way that saw her completely, without reduction or simplification. And she had walked away from him across the parking lot and had not seen him again. She carried that walk across a parking lot in her memory for the rest of her life. The specific quality of the light, the sound of the gravel under her shoes, the precise moment when she was far enough away that turning around would have required a decision rather than simply a continuation of what she was already doing. She did not turn around. She kept walking. And that walk, she would tell Daniel 50 years later, in a care facility common room, was the hardest thing she ever did. Not the adoption, not the marriage, not the 40 years of Sunday dinners with the extra plate. The walk. Because the walk was the moment she chose the life that was possible over the life that was real, and she had to do it in motion, in real time, with her back to everything she was leaving, without the mercy of being able to stop and think about it first. The baby came in October of 1961, a boy, healthy, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, born on a Tuesday morning in a Cincinnati hospital that Eleanor had never been to before and would never return to. The delivery was without medical complication, and the professionals who attended it were kind in the bounded and procedural way of people whose kindness is real, but whose role does not permit them to extend it into the territory that would actually have been most useful, the territory of staying, of holding the question open, of acknowledging that what was about to happen was not simply a transaction, but a severance, a real and permanent and human one, and that the young woman in the bed was old enough to understand exactly what was being severed. Eleanor was allowed to hold him for 45 minutes. He had, she would say, decades later, his father's forehead, the same broad and clear forehead, the same particular quality of the brow line, and her own hands, the same long fingers, the same specific shape at the first knuckle that she had always been slightly self-conscious about on herself, and that she found, looking at them miniaturized and perfect at the ends of this small person's arms, extraordinarily and unexpectedly beautiful. She held him for 45 minutes, and she gave him a name, privately, in the silence of her own mind, a name the adoption paperwork would not record, and the family receiving him would not know, and that she would carry without speaking it for the next 50 years. She named him Thomas, not because it was a name she had chosen thoughtfully in advance, but because it arrived in her mind in that hospital room with the quality of a certainty, because it was a name she loved, and because giving him a name, even a private name that existed only inside her, was the last act of mothering she was able to perform for him, and she was not going to forfeit it. Then a woman she had never met came into the room, and Eleanor handed him over, and the woman carried him out, and Eleanor was alone in the hospital room with the specific and absolute quality of a presence that has just left, the shape of a person in a space they occupied one moment and do not occupy the next, real and warm and utterly gone. She came home to Dayton with empty arms and a silence inside her that was not grief in the conventional sense, not the grief of a thing that was lost, but the grief of a thing that was given away, and the distinction between those two experiences, Eleanor understood, was one that the people around her would never fully appreciate. A lost thing is taken from you. A given thing is something you handed over with your own hands. You live with both kinds of absence, but you live with them differently. You process a lost thing, a given thing. You carry. She carried it home to Dayton. She carried it through the 4 months between October of 1961 and February of 1962, when she married Gerald Calloway in a simple ceremony, with a simple white dress and a small gathering of family. And Gerald was kind and steady and present, and did not ask her about the things he already knew in outline, and did not press her about the things he did not. She carried it to Columbus. She carried it through the arrival of Thomas, the Thomas she was keeping, the Thomas named privately and deliberately for the Thomas she was not, and through Sandra's arrival 2 years after that, and through the building of the household and the neighborhood friendships and the church community and the routines and the rituals that gave the Calloway family its particular shape and texture. She carried it in the only visible way she could. She carried it to the table every Sunday in the form of a plate. The first extra plate appeared on the Calloway Sunday dinner table in November of 1962. Thomas, the Thomas she was raising, the 9-month-old Thomas, who would grow up knowing only that he had a brother named Daniel and a sister named Sandra, and parents who fed him well and kept his world stable, was too young to notice. Gerald noticed. He said nothing. Eleanor put the plate out without explanation and without ceremony, simply adding it to the table setting as naturally as she added everything else, and went back to the kitchen, and Gerald sat at the head of the table and looked at the extra setting for a moment, and then looked at his food, and began eating, and that was the beginning of 41 years of the same exchange conducted without a word. The understanding between them, never spoken, never negotiated, never arrived at through any conversation that either of them could have described, afterward, was complete and immediately operational. Eleanor would carry what she was carrying in the way she needed to carry it, and Gerald would not interfere with the carrying of it. Whether that understanding was an act of love or an act of avoidance or some American masculine version of grace that simply does not have a proper word for itself, is a question that every person who hears this story will answer differently. What it was, functionally, was a wall, a respectful, mutually maintained, completely impenetrable wall between two people who had agreed to share everything except the one thing that mattered most. The plate stayed. Week after week, year after year, through Thomas's childhood and Sandra's childhood and Daniel's arrival in 1970 and Daniel's childhood, through the children's graduations and their departures and their return visits and the gradual quieting of the house as it emptied out, through the neighborhood's changes, through Gerald's business growing and then plateauing and then winding down, through Eleanor's friendships and her church work and her reading and the particular and practiced calm of a woman who has organized her entire interior life around the maintenance of a secret and has become, in the process, extraordinarily good at the maintenance of everything else. The plate was there. The extra setting was made every Sunday with the same precision, and the same deliberateness, and the same complete absence of explanation that had characterized it from the first Sunday it appeared. And the family ate around it, year after year. And the question lived inside Daniel, from the age of 12 onward, and the silence held, and the years accumulated on top of it, the way sediment accumulates on top of something buried, layer by layer, imperceptibly, until the thing underneath is deep enough that you have almost forgotten, on a daily basis, that it is there, almost, but not quite, never quite. Eleanor tracked what she could, through channels that were narrow and unreliable, and that required the patience of someone who has accepted that full knowledge is not currently available, and partial knowledge will have to be sufficient. She worked at the edges of what the adoption system of the 1960s and 1970s would permit her to access. The agency updated its privacy policies in the mid-1970s in ways that allowed birth parents who met certain conditions to request limited non-identifying information about their placed children. Eleanor requested everything she was eligible to request. She learned that the child had been placed with a family in Ohio. He had not been moved out of state. He had stayed in Ohio. He was healthy at the time of the last contact the agency had on record. That was the sum of what the official channels would give her. And it was almost nothing, and it was, at the same time, enough to do something specific and essential for Eleanor. It kept the plate from being merely ceremonial. It kept it honest. It kept the space from being a performance of grief and made it instead what Eleanor always intended it to be, a genuine acknowledgement of a genuinely existing person, a real child growing up somewhere in Ohio, under Ohio's weather and Ohio's seasons and Ohio's particular quality of winter light, being fed on Sundays by somebody, being loved by somebody, becoming somebody. She did not know who, but he was real. He was there. And the plate was for him. She hired a private investigator in 1987. Thomas and Sandra were both out of the house by then, and Daniel was 17 and beginning to be consumed by his own forward motion, and the household had the particular and slightly strange quality of a space that has been organized around children and is now beginning to operate without them. And Eleanor had time and privacy and, perhaps, the specific courage that comes when you realize the window for certain things is not unlimited. The investigator worked for 3 weeks. He came back with a name, a city, and an age that corresponded. Eleanor paid the fee. She took the single sheet of paper with the name and the city on it, put it in a plain white envelope, sealed it with tape along all 4 edges, and carried it to the coat closet at the back of the bedroom hallway. She put it in the inside pocket of her brown winter coat, which she wore rarely enough that it would not be disturbed. And there it stayed for 25 years, in the dark interior of a coat pocket, known only to Eleanor, sealed against any accidental opening, maintained in its sealed state by the specific and long-cultivated human capacity for leaving something alone when opening it would require a courage that has not yet fully arrived. She took it out once, in the winter of 1998. She sat at the kitchen table on a weekday morning when Gerald was in the garage and the house was quiet, and she held the envelope in both hands for approximately 10 minutes. She felt the single sheet of paper inside it. She looked at the sealed edges, and she put it back. She was not ready. The not readiness was not simple cowardice, or at least it was not only cowardice. It was also the specific paralysis of a person who understands that knowing fully will require choosing again, and who is not sure she has enough left after the choices she has already made to survive another one. If she opened the envelope and confirmed the name and found the city and ultimately found the person, she would have to decide what to do with him. She would have to decide, in full view of the family she had built and the life she had made, whether the truth was worth what telling it would cost. She had made that calculation once, in a Cincinnati hospital in October of 1961, and she had been paying its cost every day for 27 years. And so the envelope stayed in the coat pocket, and the plate stayed on the table, and Eleanor kept living. The diagnosis came in February of 2012. Early onset dementia. Daniel was the one who drove her to the neurologist's office, because he had moved back to Columbus 4 years earlier, partly for work, and partly because Sandra's death from breast cancer in 2009 had done something irreversible to his understanding of what it meant to live far from the people who would eventually need him. He sat in the examination room and listened to the doctor use the precise and clinical and almost entirely inadequate language of medicine to describe what was happening to his mother's brain and what would continue to happen, and at approximately what pace. He watched Eleanor receive this information with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her face producing exactly nothing readable. The way she received everything that required composure, completely, internally, keeping the surface smooth while whatever was actually happening happened somewhere below the level at which anyone watching her could see it. On the drive home, she asked him to stop at the grocery store. She needed butter. He pulled into the parking lot, and she sat without moving for a moment, looking through the windshield at the entrance of the store with the concentrated and interior quality of a woman doing something very large in the time available to her. And then she said, without turning to look at him, in the quiet and certain voice of someone who has been moving toward a decision for a long time and has just arrived at it, "There is an envelope in the back of my coat closet, the brown winter coat. Inside the left pocket. I need you to find it tonight and put it somewhere safe, somewhere you can find it when you need it. Don't open it yet. Just keep it safe." He asked her what was in it. She said, "Something you are going to need to understand eventually, and I want to make sure it is somewhere you can find it before I am no longer able to tell you where it is." He asked her when he would know it was time to open it. She said, "You will know." He found the envelope that evening. After Carrie had put the girls to bed and the house was quiet, he held it in both hands and felt the single sheet inside and looked at the tape, sealed along all 4 edges, and put it in the fireproof box where he kept his passport and his daughter's birth certificates and the other documents that only matter in the kind of circumstances you spend most of your life hoping will not arise. He kept it there for 8 months without opening it, because she had asked him not to yet, and because honoring that felt like the one useful thing available to him in a situation that had very few. The dementia moved in the early months the way dementia always moves in the early stages, not as a flood, but as a tide, irregular and deceptive, advancing and retreating far enough sometimes that the ground looked firmer than it was, and then advancing again, further than it had before. Some days Eleanor was entirely herself, sharp and present, and slightly impatient with the pace at which the world around her was processing things, the woman her children had always known, the woman with 3 moves of lead time on everyone else in the room. Other days the gaps appeared. A name arrived sideways. A sentence started in one direction and arrived somewhere unexpected. The family managed these shifts with the combination of love and practicality, and ongoing, unresolved grief that families bring to the slow decline of a parent they love. Doing what needed to be done in the way it needed to be done, and not finding adequate language for any of it. And then, alongside the gaps and the sideways arrivals, there were the days the family eventually came to call among themselves the talking days. Days when the disease loosened the mechanisms of Eleanor's lifelong self-editing, the careful and practiced architecture of what she said and what she kept inside, and the things that had been maintained below the surface for decades began rising without her permission and without the filters she would have applied if the filters had still been fully operational. She told a nurse on a Tuesday afternoon that she had loved a man named Raymond before she loved her husband, and that she still thought about him, and that she hoped he had found something good in his life because he had deserved something good, and she had not been able to give it to him. She told Carrie, during a Sunday afternoon visit in September of 2012, that she had a son she had not raised. She said it in the direct and unguarded way of a person who has been holding a specific sentence inside for 50 years and has finally, through some combination of exhaustion and surrender, let it out, clearly, quietly, without theater or apology. She said she had a son she had not raised, and that she had kept a place for him at her dinner table for most of her adult life, and that the thing she had always hoped for him most was not success or achievement or any of the things that people typically say they hope for their children, but something simpler, that he had had a yard, that he had grown up in a house with a yard, because she had always believed, without being entirely able to explain why, that children who grew up with space around them grew up with more space inside them, and space was what she had wanted for him when she could not give him anything else. Then she asked Carrie if she wanted more coffee, in exactly the same calm and conversational tone, as though they had been discussing the weather. Carrie said yes, please. She sat across from Eleanor and kept her face warm and her voice steady, and she waited until Daniel came to pick her up. And then she told him in the car, quietly and completely, every word his mother had said. Daniel sat in the driveway after Carrie went inside. He sat there long enough that the outdoor light went on and then off again on its timer. Then he went inside and went to the fireproof box. He took out the envelope. He held it in both hands for a moment, the way Eleanor had held it at the kitchen table in 1998, feeling the single sheet inside, looking at the sealed edges, understanding that once he opened it, the question he had been carrying since he was 12 years old was going to become something he had to do something with, rather than simply something he had to carry. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, written in Eleanor's precise and schoolteacher cursive, in the blue ink she had always used. At the top, a name, Marcus Allen Thompson. Below it, a birth year, 1961. Below that, a city, Cleveland, Ohio. And below that, written in a slightly different pen, in smaller and more deliberate letters than the rest of the page, as though added at a later time, and with a different kind of intention than the information above it. He was healthy when I left him. I have to believe he stayed that way. I named you Thomas, so I would always have a Thomas at my table. I set his plate so he would always have a seat. I am sorry I was not brave enough to do anything more than that. Daniel read the letter 4 times at the kitchen table. Then he sat with it without reading it, simply looking at the shape of her handwriting, at the space between the lines, at the 2 different pens that told their own small story about the distance in time between the information and the apology. At the apology itself, short and plain and devastating in the way that apologies are devastating when they come from people who are not in the habit of apologizing. When they name with complete honesty the specific nature of the failure they are acknowledging, when they arrive too late to change anything and are offered anyway, because not offering them would be a worse thing than the inadequacy of offering them now. He sat with that letter for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Thomas in Seattle. Thomas answered on the fourth ring, groggy and immediately alert, the voice of a man woken at midnight by a sibling calling across 2 time zones, who knows before he has finished waking up that something has happened. Daniel told him about the envelope, about the letter, about the name, Marcus Allen Thompson, born 1961, Cleveland, Ohio. He said all of it clearly and completely and waited. There was silence on the line, and then Thomas said, "I know." Daniel had prepared himself for a number of possible responses from his brother. Shock, disbelief, the long and reformulating silence of someone processing information that has just rearranged their understanding of their entire family. What he had not prepared for was those 2 words, delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has just been given, by the arrival of this midnight phone call, the first legitimate opportunity to put it down. Thomas told him he had been 19 years old. He had been home from college on a break, helping Eleanor reorganize the living room bookshelves, one of the household tasks she periodically recruited visiting children to assist with, knowing that a second pair of hands made the job faster and that she liked the company while doing it. A folded piece of paper had slipped from between 2 books and fallen to the floor, and Thomas had bent to pick it up and unfolded it before he understood what he was holding, and read the first several lines before he understood what he was reading. And by the time he understood what he was reading, he had read enough to know everything the letter contained. He had folded it precisely as he had found it, and placed it back between the same 2 books in exactly the same position, and gone back to the shelving without a word, and had not said anything to anyone for 22 years. Not to Eleanor, not to Gerald, not to Sandra, who had died without ever knowing, not to Daniel. He had held it in the same interior and private place that Eleanor had held her half of the story, and had made the same calculation she had made, that the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of staying silent, that what Eleanor had built was worth more than the truth it was built around, that the person in the letter had his own complete life, and that pulling him into this one might destroy what Eleanor had spent 4 decades constructing and still not give anyone anything worth the destruction. Daniel asked him about the plate. Thomas said yes. He had known what the plate was for. He had sat at the Sunday table every week knowing, and had watched Eleanor set it, and had said nothing. Daniel asked him how. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What was I supposed to do, Daniel? Tell her to stop?" The line was silent for a while after that. Daniel did not have an answer. He is not sure, even now, that one exists. Marcus Allen Thompson, born October 1961, Cleveland, Ohio. By 2012, the combination of publicly available genealogical databases, digitized public records, and the methodical focus of a man who has been waiting most of his life to understand something, had become a genuinely powerful set of tools, and Daniel used all of them with the careful and unhurried patience of someone who understands that the thing he is looking for is too important to be rushed toward. He cross-referenced names against birth years and cities, and the known information about the adoption agency's placement geography, until the field of candidates narrowed, and then narrowed further, and then became one. A Marcus A. Thompson, age 50, residing in Akron, Ohio, retired from the United States Postal Service after a full career, married for 30 years, 2 adult children, a social media presence that was minimal and infrequent, the digital footprint of a man who had created an account because his children had persuaded him to, and maintained it without great enthusiasm. There was a photograph. Daniel found it and looked at it for a long time. There was something around the eyes, a quality that he recognized before he could name it, a watchfulness, a composure, a particular sense of a person who is taking in more than they are giving out. And then he named it and sat back from his computer and let out a slow and careful breath, because what he recognized in Marcus Thompson's face was not something he had ever seen in his own reflection, or in his brother's features, or anywhere else in the Calloway family's visible inheritance. It was something he had seen in his mother's face every day of his life, Eleanor's quality, the 3 moves ahead quality, the watchful and interior and completely present quality that the disease had diminished in some ways and had not, apparently, been able to touch in others. Present in the face of a man standing in a backyard in Akron, laughing at something off camera, 50 years after Eleanor had held him in a Cincinnati hospital room for 45 minutes and given him a private name and handed him to a stranger. The inheritance of a way of seeing, carried forward through a connection that had lasted less than an hour and had never, in any practical sense, been a connection at all. And yet there it was, unmistakable, in the photograph on his screen. Daniel wrote him a letter, by hand, because some things require the slowness and the commitment and the irreversibility of handwriting, and this was one of them. It took 4 drafts across 2 evenings. The first draft was too impersonal, approaching the matter from a distance that felt dishonest given what the matter actually was. The second was too emotional, leaning into the weight of the moment in a way that felt like it was making demands of someone who had not yet been given the opportunity to decide how he felt about any of it. The third said too much about Eleanor's condition in a way that Daniel recognized, rereading it, as a form of manipulation, creating urgency to compel a response that should be given freely or not at all. He crossed out the third draft entirely and started again. The fourth was 3 pages. He identified himself plainly and honestly. He said what he had found and how he had found it. He said he was not reaching out to make any claim or create any obligation. He said that if Marcus had no interest in any of this, the letter could be discarded and Daniel would not contact him again, and he meant that. And he wrote it in a way that was meant to be believed. He sealed it and mailed it on a Thursday afternoon, and then he waited, which was the hardest part, because waiting was the one thing in the situation entirely outside his control. 12 days later, his phone rang from an Akron area code he did not recognize. He answered immediately. The voice on the other end was low and measured and careful in the particular way that a voice is careful when the person using it is managing something very large with the same composure that comes from being, constitutionally, a person who manages large things with composure, not by suppressing them, but by holding them steadily, without allowing their size to become the first thing anyone else encounters. The voice said, "Is this Daniel Calloway?" He said yes. And the voice said, "I think you might be my brother." Marcus Allen Thompson had known he was adopted since he was 7 years old. His adoptive parents, Harold Thompson, a retired school administrator, and June Thompson, a registered nurse, a middle-class black family in Cleveland who had wanted a child and had pursued adoption with the same careful intentionality they brought to everything that mattered to them, had told him early and honestly, in keeping with the guidance that adoptive parent communities were beginning, by the early 1970s, to receive and act on, that children told the truth about their origins early, in the context of a secure and loving home, carry that truth more stably than children who encounter it late or by accident. Marcus had grown up knowing he was adopted. He knew, from a packet of non-identifying information the adoption agency had provided to the Thompsons at placement, that his birth mother had been a young white woman from Dayton, Ohio. That was the complete and entire extent of his documented knowledge about his biological origins for the first 5 decades of his life. He did not know Eleanor's name. He did not know that Raymond Ellis had ever existed. He knew only that in October of 1961, a decision had been made that had resulted in Harold and June Thompson receiving a healthy baby boy and bringing him home to Cleveland, and raising him as fully and as completely and as lovingly as any child in the history of that city had ever been raised. Harold coached him in baseball and taught him to maintain a car and argued with him at the dinner table about politics and history with the specific intensity of a father who respects his son enough to engage with his mind rather than simply direct it. June Thompson was the kind of mother that resists easy summary, the kind whose patience was active and deliberate rather than passive, whose presence in a room changed the quality of the room, who sat with Marcus through every failure and every illness and every difficult thing, without once making him feel that the sitting was an imposition. They were extraordinary parents. Marcus grew up in a house full of books and dinner table conversation and the expectation that he would think carefully and contribute something real, and he did, and he became fully and completely and without qualification his parents' son. He retired from the United States Postal Service after 26 years. He had been married to Donna, a retired school principal, the most organized human being he had ever encountered, the person he trusted most in the world, for 30 years. They had 2 adult children. Their house in Akron had a good yard. He had thought about searching for his birth mother more than once. He had started the process in his early 30s, filed some preliminary inquiries, learned that certain records were accessible through updated agency policies, begun to map what a full search would require, and then stopped. He stopped because June Thompson was still alive, and something in him, something he could identify only as a form of fierce and protective loyalty to the woman who had raised him, was not able to go looking for the woman who hadn't, while the woman who had was still present in the world. June died in 2009. He did not resume the search after that, and he was not entirely sure why. He told Daniel, on that first phone call, that he thought perhaps the urgency had shifted into something different over the years. Not resolved exactly, but settled into a different shape, something he had made a provisional and workable peace with. He was 50 years old. He had a full life. He was not certain anymore that opening this particular door would give him something he did not already have. And then a handwritten letter had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. He had read it 4 times. He had gone and sat in his car in the driveway for an hour, looking at nothing. He had come back inside and found Donna in the kitchen and handed her the letter without a word, and watched her read it and waited. Donna had set it down on the counter, looked at him steadily, and said, "Sleep on it, then call." He had slept on it for 12 days, because he was a man who gave important things the time they required, and did not manufacture urgency in himself about things that deserved to be approached at their actual pace. Then he called. "I'm not angry," was the first thing he said to Daniel. Not a preface, a fact. Offered because he understood, with the clear-eyed intelligence that had always been his most reliable quality, that it was the thing Daniel needed to hear before anything else could be built on top of it. He had had a good life and good parents, and he was not calling to put anything down on anyone's doorstep. He was calling because he wanted to understand, and because it sounded like the window for understanding directly, from the source, was specific and narrowing. He paused. Then he asked the question that Daniel had hoped he would ask and had not allowed himself to fully believe he would. "Can I meet her?" Daniel brought the question to the family with the directness that had always characterized him in the moments that mattered. He called Thomas. He sat with Carrie for 3 hours at the kitchen table. He drove to the family house and sat across from Gerald in the living room. Gerald, who was 81 now, smaller than he had once been, managing his decline with the same implacable self-sufficiency he had brought to everything in his life, unwilling to ask for help he had not yet fully decided he required, and told him everything, who he had found, who had called, what Marcus Thompson had asked. Gerald listened without interrupting, with the complete and unhurried attention of a man who has known for a long time that this moment was coming, and has simply been waiting to learn what shape it would take. When Daniel finished, Gerald was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the point past Daniel's shoulder, where he had always appeared to look when he was holding something back that the available language could not quite accommodate. And then he said, very quietly, with the weight of 40 years of Sunday dinners behind every word, "She's been setting that plate for 40 years. Daniel said, "I know, Dad." Gerald said, "If she wants to see him, she should see him." Then he stood up and went to the kitchen and made coffee. And that was the blessing, spare and plain, and carrying considerably more than it appeared to on the surface, which was how Gerald had always communicated anything that genuinely mattered to him. Thomas flew in from Seattle. The three of them sat at Daniel's kitchen table past midnight, moving through the risks and the ethics and the questions they could not fully answer. Thomas's concern was Eleanor's stability. The disease's variability meant there was no way to guarantee that on the Sunday Marcus came, she would be clear enough to hold the full weight of what the meeting was meant to be, that the moment would arrive on a day when she could actually receive it. Daniel said, "She wrote a letter in 2 different pens, which means she came back to it. She kept it for 25 years without opening it, which means she knew exactly what it contained and chose to maintain it rather than release it. She has been setting his plate every week since before I was born. Whatever the disease has taken from her, it has not taken this. I think she knows what this is." They called Marcus the following morning. They agreed on a Sunday. It felt right that it should be a Sunday. Everything about this story had always been about Sunday, and whatever this was going to be, it belonged on the day that had always been held open for it. Marcus Thompson arrived in Columbus on the second Sunday in April of 2012. He drove down from Akron alone because he had decided, and Donna had understood without requiring an explanation, that the arrival was something he needed to do by himself, in whatever time it needed to take, without anyone watching him do it. He pulled into the care facility parking lot at 11 in the morning and sat in his car for a few minutes. looking at the building with the quiet and inward focus of a man who is about to do something that has been true for 50 years and is only now becoming real in the most concrete and irreversible sense. The sense that requires you to get out of the car and walk through a door and be in the same room with it. He got out of the car. Daniel was waiting at the entrance. They stood facing each other in the parking lot for the first time. Two men in their 40s and 50s who shared a mother, one of whom had grown up knowing he had brothers he had never met, the other of whom was only now understanding the full dimensions of who his family actually was. And neither of them had a script for the moment, and the moment was too large for a handshake in the conventional sense, and too uncertain for anything warmer. And they stood in the specific and slightly absurd awkwardness of a situation that no available social convention was designed to cover. Then Marcus said, "Is this weird?" And Daniel said, "Extremely." And Marcus laughed, a genuine and completely unguarded laugh, the kind that arrives before the composure has a chance to intercept it. And that laugh, in the parking lot of a care facility in Columbus on a Sunday morning in April, was the thing that broke something open between them, the thing that made the rest of the morning possible. They shook hands. Daniel brought him inside. Thomas was waiting in the lobby. He looked at Marcus Thompson, at the face that carried Eleanor's watchfulness, and Raymond Ellis's forehead, and something that was entirely its own in the jaw and the quality of his stillness. And he said, with the directness of a man who has 22 years of a specific regret and recognizes this as the only available moment for acknowledging it, "I should have done this a long time ago." Marcus looked at him and said, simply, without making Thomas pay any more for the delay than the saying of it cost, "You're doing it now." Eleanor was in the common room near the window when they came in. She was wearing her good blue cardigan, the one she had asked for specifically that morning, which the nursing staff had noted with the quiet recognition of people who have learned to read these requests as a form of communication from residents whose other forms of communication have become less reliable. She looked up when the three men came through the door. Her eyes moved through the room the way her eyes had always moved, taking in everything, measuring, accounting for what was present, and they found Marcus Thompson and stayed there. The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when something real is happening in them. Later, two nurses who had been in the common room that Sunday would describe what happened in the next few seconds as the most remarkable thing they had witnessed in their combined years of working in memory care. Not because it was dramatic, because it was the complete opposite of dramatic. Because Eleanor Calloway, a woman who some mornings could not reliably name all of her grandchildren, who sometimes looked at her own room as though she were seeing it for the first time, looked at a man she had never once been in the same room with in her entire life, and said, without hesitation, without confusion, without a moment's uncertainty, with the clear and settled certainty of someone identifying something they have always known, "You have Raymond's forehead." Marcus sat down in the chair directly across from her. He reached across the table and took both of her hands in both of his hands. He said, "I heard you kept a place for me," Eleanor said. "Every Sunday." He asked her how long. She said, "Since the Sunday before you were born." What they said to each other in the hour that followed, in the hour that Daniel and Thomas spent in the hallway outside the common room, speaking occasionally and quietly and mostly sitting in the specific and genuine silence of two men who have just witnessed something they do not have language for yet and are not in a hurry to find it. Neither Marcus nor any of the Calloway children have disclosed in full. That conversation belonged to Eleanor and to Marcus. and the privacy of it has been honored by everyone close enough to the story to have asked. What the family has shared is what happened at the end of it. When the door opened and Eleanor and Marcus came out together, Eleanor was calm, not the performed calm of the woman she had spent 60 years training herself to be, but a different kind, the deep and settled and released kind that arrives when something carried under enormous and sustained pressure is finally and fully set down, when the body and the mind both recognize that they no longer have to hold what they have been holding, and they let it go, and the difference is physical as well as interior. She moved through the common room with the easy authority she had always carried in spaces she considered her own, and she introduced Marcus to the people present, with the warmth and the complete absence of ceremony of a woman introducing a neighbor she is pleased to have everyone finally meet. "This is Marcus," she said. "He's been meaning to visit for a while." There is something in that sentence that every person who heard it has carried with them since. The lightness of it. The domestication of 50 years of grief and ritual, and maintained silence into the kind of easy social remark that would not be out of place at a church potluck. You could read it as the disease smoothing the full weight of the moment into something her diminished capacity could manage. Or you could read it as Eleanor Calloway, doing what Eleanor Calloway had always done, working 3 moves ahead, finding the exactly right language for the situation, choosing the words that would bring Marcus into the family without making his arrival an occasion for grief or obligation or a wound to be examined and assigned. He has been meaning to visit for a while. He is here now. He belongs here. That is all of it. That is enough. Daniel brought Marcus to the family house 3 weeks later to meet Gerald. Gerald opened the door, saw Marcus on the porch, and was still in the doorway for a moment with the specific stillness of a man who has spent 40 years knowing something abstractly and is now encountering it in the most concrete and undeniable way possible, in physical form, on his front porch, on a Tuesday afternoon in April. Then he stepped back and let them in. He sat in the wingback chair he had occupied for 40 years and looked at Marcus with the careful and unhurried attention of a man who is taking something in completely before deciding what to do with it. Something moved in Gerald's face during that looking. Something that Daniel, standing slightly behind Marcus, had not seen in his father's face in a very long time. A quality that was not grief exactly, and not relief exactly, but something that lived in the specific emotional territory between those two things. Something that looked like what a man's face does when he has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just, for the first time, found another person in the room who is also carrying part of it. Gerald said, "She set that plate every week," Marcus said. "She told me." Gerald said, "I thought about asking her to stop 100 times. I never did." He paused, and in the pause was everything. The 40 years of Sunday dinners, the arrangement between two people who had loved each other in whatever way they loved each other, and had managed each other's grief in whatever way. They were capable of managing it, the decision made over and over and over again, every Sunday, to let the plate stay and not ask what it meant. Then he said, "I don't know if that was the right thing." Marcus looked at him with the steady and composed gaze that was. Daniel now understood completely the specific inheritance of Eleanor's way of seeing, and he said, "I can't answer that for you." Gerald nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man accepting something he has known for a long time he would eventually have to accept. Then he got up and made coffee, and the three of them sat in the kitchen of the Columbus house and talked for 2 hours about ordinary things. Marcus's years with the Postal Service, his children, the Akron neighborhood where he and Donna lived, what Harold and June Thompson had been like as parents, what Cleveland was like in the winters. Gerald listened more than he spoke, which was consistent with everything he had always been. And when Marcus stood up to leave and they walked to the front door, Gerald held out his hand, and Marcus took it, and Gerald held it for a beat longer than a handshake requires, and said, "She is a good woman. She made a hard choice, and she carried it well." Marcus looked at him directly and said, "I believe you." That was the only direct conversation Gerald Calloway and Marcus Thompson ever had. Gerald died 14 months later, in June of 2013, of a heart attack at 82 years old, in the house he had lived in for 4 decades. He died in the room where 40 years of Sunday dinners had happened, having never spoken directly to Eleanor about Raymond Ellis, or about the adoption, or about what the plate had meant, or about the weight of the silence they had both maintained across 60 years of marriage. Whether that silence was the failure of his love for her, or the most complete expression of it that he knew how to offer, is a question that belongs to each person who hears this story, and I do not think it has an answer that would satisfy everyone, and I am not sure it is supposed to. Eleanor's condition moved through 2013 and into 2014 with the patient and incremental cruelty of a disease that does not hurry. The good days became fewer. The window of clarity that had allowed those extraordinary conversations, with Daniel about the envelope, with Marcus in the common room on a Sunday morning in April, narrowed and then largely closed, the way windows close in late autumn. Not all at once, but progressively, until one day you realize that the light has changed, and you cannot remember exactly when it changed, but you know that it is different now and will not go back to what it was. Eleanor was still there, in the essential and irreducible sense. Still the woman who asked for her good cardigan on the days when something significant was happening. Still possessed, on certain clear afternoons, of those watchful and 3 moves-ahead eyes that had never entirely stopped working, even as so much else around them had. But the full architecture of the story she had spent 50 years carrying was less reliably accessible to her now, and the conversations that had been so extraordinary in their clarity and their completeness became rare, and then rarer. Marcus came when he could and sat with her in the common room and held her hands. Sometimes she looked at him with the immediate and certain recognition of that first Sunday morning. Sometimes she looked at him with the gentle uncertainty of a woman trying to place a face she feels she should know but cannot quite locate in the geography of her current memory. Both of those encounters, Marcus said, were meaningful to him in their own ways, because she had kept his place at her table for 50 years without ever being in the same room with him, and now he was in the room. Whatever she was able to receive of that on any given afternoon, the fact of his presence was real, and it had been earned, and it was his. She died on a Tuesday morning in February of 2015, 71 years old. She died in her room at the care facility, in her sleep, in the gray and quiet light of an early Ohio winter morning, without apparent distress. Daniel was there. He had driven over before the sun came up, on the wordless and specific instinct that adult children of aging parents sometimes develop in the final weeks. The sense of a frequency beginning to change, of something in the atmosphere preparing to shift in a direction it will not shift back from. He sat beside her and held her hand, and he was there when she went, and the room was quiet after, and he sat with her for a long time in that quiet, in the company of everything she had been, and everything she had carried, and everything she had finally, in the years before the end, been able to put down. At Eleanor Calloway's funeral, Marcus Thompson sat in the second row. Daniel had told him without hesitation and without qualification that he should be there. You are family. You have been family since before any of us understood what that meant. Your seat is not the empty one anymore. And Marcus had come, with Donna beside him, and taken his place among the people who had known Eleanor Calloway as a neighbor and a church friend and the woman you called when you needed someone in a waiting room at 2 a.m. There were people at that funeral who did not know who the man in the second row was. They noticed him the way you notice something that is where it is supposed to be, but that you cannot immediately account for. And they did not ask, because something in the arrangement of the day communicated clearly enough that this was not the moment for the question. Thomas delivered the eulogy. He spoke about Eleanor's intelligence, her precision, the specific quality of her commitment to the people in her world, the showing up, always, in whatever form the showing up required. He said she was a woman who understood, somewhere below the level of language, that love was not a feeling that arrived and sustained itself without effort. It was a practice, something you performed deliberately and consistently over a long period of time, in the specific form that the moment required, even when the performing of it cost you something real, even when the people around you did not fully understand what you were doing or why, even when the only language available to you was something as simple and as quiet as a full plate at the end of a table on a Sunday evening. He did not say the word plate. He did not say Marcus's name. He did not need to, because Marcus Thompson was in the second row, present and real and accounted for, and the family knew who he was, and that knowing was the whole of what needed to be said. In the weeks after the funeral, clearing Eleanor's room, Daniel found on her bedside table a photograph of Marcus Thompson in a small plain frame. Marcus in the care facility parking lot, in his winter coat, laughing at something off camera, taken on the day he first came. Someone had printed it and given it to Eleanor, and Eleanor had placed it on her nightstand beside the photograph of Daniel and the photograph of Thomas at Christmas and the photograph of Sandra before she got sick and the photograph of her grandchildren at the beach. Just there, level with all the others, in the place where she could see it every morning when she opened her eyes, part of the family, where it had always belonged, long before the photograph existed to prove it. From the kitchen of the family house, Daniel kept a plate, a plain white ceramic dinner plate, part of a set Eleanor had bought in 1966, not remarkable in any material sense, but more worn than the others in the set. The glaze more rubbed at the center, the rim chipped at one small point near the edge, because it had been taken out of the cabinet every single Sunday for 41 years, and filled and set and washed and put away and taken out again, used for the most specific and unrelenting and intentional of purposes, to hold a place, to keep a space, to refuse, week after week across 4 decades, to act as though the person it was set for did not exist and did not have a seat at the table. Daniel has that plate in his house in Columbus. It lives in the cabinet with his other plates, and on Sundays, when the table is full, when his daughters are home and Marcus and Donna have driven down from Akron and the food is ready, he takes that plate out of the cabinet and sets it at the table, not as a memorial, not for absence, for the opposite reason entirely, Because the chair is no longer empty. Because the seat kept open for 50 years is finally, completely, permanently filled. Because Eleanor Calloway spent 41 years refusing to let the table be complete without the person she had been forced to give away, and the table is now complete, and she was right to refuse, and the plate belongs at the table the same way Marcus Thompson belongs at the table, fully, without qualification, as family, which is what he has always been. Here is what I have been sitting with since the first time I encountered this story, and what I want to leave with you before this ends. Eleanor Calloway was not a perfect woman. She made a choice under conditions so constrained and so coercive that calling it a choice at all requires a particular and honest reckoning with the systems that produce those conditions, the father's absolute authority, the era's social geography, the specific and unforgiving arithmetic of what was available to an 18-year-old girl in Dayton, Ohio, in 1961, who did not have money or power or the world's permission to choose the life she actually wanted with the man she actually loved. She could not go with Raymond. She could not keep the baby. She was 18 years old and alone, and had already spent everything she had on the one refusal she could make, the refusal to end the pregnancy, and did not have enough left to fight the adoption as well. And she spent the next 50 years doing the one thing that remained available to her. She remembered. She refused to pretend. She refused to perform the comfortable fiction that the table was complete when she knew it was not. She set the plate every Sunday for 41 years, not as the indulgence of a grief that should have been moved past, not as a punishment for anyone, not as a performance for an audience she did not have, but as the quiet and unbreakable and entirely private insistence of a woman who understood that keeping faith with the truth of a thing, even in the only invisible and interior way available to her, was better than agreeing to the lie. She was right. The plate kept the door open, and when the door finally opened, when Marcus Thompson sat across from her in a care facility common room on a Sunday morning in April of 2012, and took her hands, she was ready. She had been ready for 50 years. She knew him by his father's forehead, immediately and without hesitation. She told him his seat had been kept, and he held her hands. And that was the conversation they had been building toward for half a century. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that was still possible, and Eleanor took it with both hands. Marcus Thompson had a good life. He was loved fully and deliberately by people who chose him and raised him completely, and he grew up with a yard, exactly what Eleanor had always hoped for, without knowing the hoping of it would turn out to be exactly right. He is not a story of damage. He is a man who arrived in his 50s at the discovery that his family was larger and more complicated and more human than he had known, and found that the discovery added to what he already had rather than diminishing it, because by the time it arrived, he was secure enough in who he was to hold it without being rearranged by it. He sat in the second row at Eleanor's funeral because he is her son. That did not require 50 years of shared meals and school pickups and holiday mornings to be true. It was true from October of 1961. Eleanor knew it. She kept it. Every single Sunday. And when the time came, there was a place set and waiting. Before we go, I want to leave you with a question that I genuinely mean and that I want you to carry with you. After this story ends, is there something at your family's table that nobody has asked about yet? Not necessarily a secret with the specific weight and complexity of Eleanor's. Most families are not carrying something this large. But there are rituals in most families, habits repeated without explanation, Silences everyone navigates around without naming what they are navigating around, that are, if you look at them honestly and long enough, not arbitrary at all. They are the compressed and visible remains of something someone felt too deeply to release and too afraid to name directly. They are the language people reach for when the actual language is not available to them. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the most important thing you can do for the people you love is sit at the table and look directly at the thing everyone has been carefully not looking at, and ask the question out loud. The cost may be real. It was real for Daniel Calloway. It cost him a version of his family that he had believed was the true one. But what he found on the other side of asking was larger and truer and more complete than what the silence had been protecting. He found his brother. He found the full and honest truth of who his mother was. He found a plate worn smooth from 41 years of weekly use, and understood, finally and completely, what it had always been for. "Good," Eleanor said, when she sat at a table with all of them in it for the first time. "Everyone's here." She had been waiting 50 years to say that, and when she finally said it, it was true. Tell me in the comments what this story made you feel. Tell me where in the world you are watching from. Tell me what question has been sitting at your own table. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, do it right now. Because the stories we bring you here are exactly this kind. Human and complicated and real, and the kind that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Next time, we are going inside a family in rural Tennessee, where a will reading revealed that a man had been living two completely separate lives for 30 years, the same name, two different states, two different families, neither of whom had any idea the other existed, and the day both of those families walked into the same lawyer's office is a day that none of them will ever fully recover from. If this story moved you, that one will take your breath away entirely. Stay with me,